The Rose Garden. Mr. and Mrs. Anstruther were having breakfast at Westfield Hall in Essex. They were making plans for the day. "George," said Mrs. Anstruther, "you should take the car to Malden and see if you can find those knitted things I mentioned for my bazaar stall." "Well, if you want me to, Mary, I can do that. But I was going to play golf with Geoffrey Williamson this morning. The bazaar isn't until next Thursday, is it?" "What does that have to do with it, George? I thought you'd know that if I can't find what I need in Malden, I'll have to order from shops in London, and they'll probably send something completely wrong in terms of price or quality. If you already made plans with Mr. Williamson, go ahead, but I think you could have told me." "Oh, no, it wasn't a definite plan. I understand. I'll go. What are you going to do?" "Well, after taking care of the house, I'm going to plan my new rose garden. By the way, before you leave for Malden, I want you to take Collins to look at the place I chose. You know it, of course." "Well, I'm not sure I do, Mary. Is it at the upper end, towards the village?" "Goodness, no, dear George. I thought I explained that clearly. It's that small clearing just off the shrubbery path that goes towards the church." "Oh, yes, where we said there must have been a summer house once, with the old seat and the posts. But do you think there's enough sun there?" "George, please let me use some common sense. Don't give me your ideas about summer houses. Yes, there'll be plenty of sun once we get rid of some of those box bushes. I know what you're going to say, and I don't want to strip the place bare. I just want Collins to clear away the old seats and posts before I come out in an hour. And I hope you can leave soon. After lunch, I'll finish my church sketch. Maybe you could go to the golf course, or— Ah, a good idea. Yes, you finish that sketch, Mary, and I'd love a round of golf. I was going to suggest visiting the bishop, but I guess it's no use making any suggestions. Now get ready, or half the morning will be gone." Mr. Anstruther, who seemed to have been about to say something, stopped and rushed out of the room. Soon he was giving orders in the hallway. Mrs. Anstruther, a dignified woman in her 50s, went about her household duties after quickly reviewing her morning mail. Within a few minutes, Mr. Anstruther found Collins in the greenhouse, and they went to the site of the new rose garden. I don't know much about gardening, but I think Mrs. Anstruther, who always called herself a great gardener, might have chosen the wrong place. It was a small, damp clearing, bordered by a path on one side and thick bushes on the other. The grass was scarce, and the ground looked dark. Some old seats and a broken oak post in the middle of the clearing made Mr. Anstruther think there had once been a summer house there. Clearly, Collins didn't know about his mistress's plan for this patch of ground, and when Mr. Anstruther told him, he wasn't excited. "Of course I can clear those seats away quickly enough," he said. "They're not an improvement, Mr. Anstruther, and they're rotten. Look here, sir." He broke off a piece of wood. "Rotten right through. Yes, clearing those away is no problem." "And the post," said Mr. Anstruther. "That has to go too." Collins stepped closer and shook the post with both hands. Then he scratched his chin. "That post is firmly in the ground," he said. "It's been there for years, Mr. Anstruther. I doubt I can get that up as quickly as I can those seats." "But your mistress wants it out of the way in an hour," said Mr. Anstruther. Collins smiled and shook his head. "I beg your pardon, sir, but you feel it for yourself. No one can do the impossible, can they, sir? I could get the post up by after tea time, sir, but it'll need a lot of digging. What you need, you see, sir, if you'll excuse me mentioning it, you need the soil loosened around this post, and me and the boy will take a little time doing that. But these seats," Collins said, seeming to take credit for this part of the plan, "I can get the wheelbarrow and clear them in, well, less than an hour from now if you'll allow it. Only what, Collins? Well now, it's not for me to go against orders, no more than it is for you yourself, or anyone else. He added this quickly. But if you'll pardon me, sir, this isn't the place I would have picked for a rose garden. Look at those box and laurel bushes. How they block out the light. Ah, yes. But we have to get rid of some of those, of course. Oh, indeed, get rid of them. Yes, to be sure. But, I beg your pardon, Mr. Anstruther. I'm sorry, Collins, but I have to go now. I hear the car. Your mistress will explain what she wants. I'll tell her you can start on the seats now, and the post this afternoon. Good morning. Collins stood there, scratching his chin. Mrs. Anstruther wasn't happy when she heard the report, but she didn't change her plans. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, she had sent her husband off to play golf, finished her chores, and, having sent a folding chair and umbrella to the right spot, was just starting her church sketch from the shrubbery when a maid came running down the path to say Miss Wilkins had arrived. Miss Wilkins was one of the few people who had lived in the house before the Anstruthers bought it a few years ago. She was staying nearby and was probably making a goodbye visit. Maybe you could ask Miss Wilkins to join me here, said Mrs. Anstruther. Soon, Miss Wilkins, an older woman, approached. Yes, I'm leaving tomorrow, and I'll tell my brother how much you've improved the place. He'll miss the old house, of course, as I do, but the garden is really lovely now. I'm so glad you think so, but we're not done making improvements. Let me show you where I'm going to put a rose garden. It's right near here. She explained the rose garden in detail, but Miss Wilkins seemed lost in thought. Yes, lovely, she said, a bit absent-mindedly. But do you know, Mrs. Anstruther, I was thinking about the old days. I'm glad to see this spot again before you change it. Frank and I had a sort of romance about this place. Oh, said Mrs. Anstruther, smiling. Tell me about it. Something charming, I'm sure. Not really charming, but it always seemed strange to me. We were never here alone as children, and I'm not sure I'd like it now, in certain moods. It's one of those things that's hard to put into words, at least for me, and sounds silly unless you say it right. I can tell you what made us, well, almost scared of this place when we were alone. It was a hot autumn day, and Frank had disappeared somewhere in the grounds. I was looking for him to call him for tea, and walking down this path, I suddenly saw him. He wasn't hiding in the bushes like I thought, but sitting on the bench in the old summer house. There used to be a wooden one here, you know, up in the corner. He was asleep, but his face looked so terrible. I really thought he was sick or even dead. I ran to him, shook him, and told him to wake up. He did, with a scream. I assure you, the poor boy was terrified. He rushed me back to the house and was awful all night, barely sleeping. Someone had to stay up with him, as I remember. He got better soon, but for days, I couldn't get him to say why he was so upset. Finally, he said he had been asleep and had a very strange dream. He didn't see much, but he felt the scenes strongly. First, he said he was standing in a large room with a lot of people in it, and someone was opposite him who was very powerful. And he was being asked questions that seemed really important. Every time he answered, someone, either the person in front of him or someone else in the room, seemed to be, as he said, making something up against him. All the voices sounded far away to him, but he remembered parts of what they said. Where were you on the 19th of October? And is this your handwriting? And so on. I see now, of course, that he was dreaming about a trial. But we never saw the documents, and it was strange that an 8-year-old would have such a clear picture of a courtroom. All the time, he felt, he said, intense anxiety and fear and hopelessness. though I don't think he used those words to me. Then there was a gap, and he remembered being terribly restless and unhappy. And then came another picture. He said he was outside on a dark, cold morning with a little snow on the ground. It was in a street, or at least among houses, and he felt that there were many, many people there too, and that he was taken up some creaky wooden stairs and stood on a kind of platform. The only thing he could actually see was a small fire burning near him. Someone who had been holding his arm let go and went towards the fire. And then he said he was more afraid then than at any other part of the dream. If I hadn't woken him up, he didn't know what would have happened to him. A strange dream for a child, isn't it? Well, so much for that. It must have been later in the year when Frank and I were here, and I was sitting in the arbor just before sunset. I noticed the sun was going down and told Frank to go inside and see if tea was ready while I finished a chapter in my book. Frank was gone longer than I expected, and the light was fading so fast that I had to bend over the book to see the words. Suddenly, I realized that someone was whispering to me inside the arbor. The only words I could make out, or thought I could, were something like, "Pull, pull, I'll push, you pull." I jumped up, quite frightened. The voice, it was a whisper, sounded so rough and angry, but also as if it came from very far away, just like in Frank's dream. But, though I was startled, I was brave enough to look around and see where the sound was coming from. And, this sounds silly, I know, but it's true, I felt that the voice was strongest when I put my ear to an old post that was part of the end of the bench. I was so sure of this that I remember making some marks on the post, as deep as I could with the scissors from my sewing basket. I don't know why. I wonder if that isn't the very same post. Well, yes, it might be. There are marks and scratches on it, but you can't be sure. Anyway, it was just like that post you have there. My father found out that we were both scared in the arbor, and he went there himself one evening after dinner. The arbor was torn down very quickly. I remember hearing my father talking about it with an old man who did odd jobs around the place. The old man said, "Don't you worry about that, sir. He's safe enough in there without anyone letting him out." But when I asked who he was talking about, I got no answer. Maybe my father or mother would have told me more when I was older, but, as you know, they both died when we were still children. It's always seemed strange to me, and I've often asked the older people in the village if they knew anything strange, but either they didn't know or they wouldn't tell me. Dear me, how I've been boring you with my childhood memories. But that arbor did really occupy our thoughts for a while. You can imagine the kind of stories we made up. Well, dear Mrs. Anstruther, I must go now. We'll see each other in town this winter, I hope, won't we? The seats and the post were cleared away that evening. Late summer weather is known to be unpredictable, and during dinner, Mrs. Collins sent a message up to ask for some brandy because her husband had caught a bad cold, and she was worried he wouldn't be able to work the next day. Mrs. Anstruther wasn't happy with her thoughts that morning. She was sure some ruffians had been in the plantation during the night. "And another thing, George," she said, "as soon as Collins is well enough, you have to tell him to do something about the owls. I've never heard anything like them, and I'm sure one perched right outside our window. If it had come inside, I would have been terrified. It must have been a very large bird, from its voice. Didn't you hear it?" "No, of course not. You were sound asleep as usual. Still, George, you don't look like you slept well last night." "My dear, I feel like another night like that would drive me crazy. You have no idea what I dreamed. I couldn't talk about them when I woke up, and if this room wasn't so bright and sunny, I wouldn't even want to think about them now." "Well, George, That's not very common for you. You must have— No, you only had the dream I had yesterday. Unless you had tea at that awful club. Did you? No, just tea and bread and butter. I really want to know how I put my dream together. Like how people put together their dreams from things they've seen or read. Look here, Mary. It was like this. If I'm not boring you— I want to hear, George. I'll tell you when I've had enough. All right. I have to tell you that it wasn't like other nightmares, because I didn't really see anyone talking to me or touching me, but it felt so real. First I was moving around, in an old-fashioned room with panels on the walls. I remember there was a fireplace with a lot of burned papers in it, and I was very anxious about something. There was someone else, a servant, I think, because I remember saying to him, "Horses, as fast as you can," and then waiting a bit. Then I heard several people coming upstairs and a noise like spurs on a wooden floor. And then the door opened, and whatever I was expecting happened. Yes, but what happened? You see, I couldn't tell. It was the kind of shock that makes you wake up in a dream. Either you wake up or everything goes black. That's what happened to me. Then I was in a large, dark-walled room with panels, I think, like the other one, and a lot of people, and I was clearly on trial, I suppose, George. Goodness, yes, Mary, I was. But did you dream that too? How strange. No, I didn't sleep enough for that. Go on, George, and I'll tell you later. Yes, well, I was on trial, for my life, I'm sure, from how I felt. I didn't have anyone to speak for me, and somewhere there was a terrible man, on the bench, I should say, except that he seemed to be attacking me unfairly, twisting everything I said and asking horrible questions. What about? Well, dates when I was in certain places, letters I was supposed to have written, why I destroyed some papers, and I remember him laughing at my answers in a way that terrified me. It doesn't sound like much, but I can tell you, Mary, it was really frightening at the time. I'm sure there was such a man once, and he must have been a terrible villain. The things he said— Thank you. I don't want to hear them. I can go to the golf course any day. How did it end? Oh, against me. He made sure of that. I wish I could describe the feeling that came after that, Mary, how it seemed to last for days. Waiting and waiting. Sometimes writing things that felt really important. Waiting for answers that never came. And then I went outside. Ah! Why do you say that? Do you know what I saw? Was it a dark, cold day, with snow in the streets and a fire burning nearby? By George, it was. You had the same nightmare. Really? Well, that's the strangest thing. Yes, it must have been an execution for treason. I know I was lying on straw and being jolted along terribly, and then had to go up some stairs, and someone was holding my arm. I remember seeing a bit of a ladder and hearing a lot of people. I really don't think I could stand to be in a crowd now and hear them all talking. But, luckily, I didn't get to the real part. The dream faded with a kind of thunder in my head. But, Mary, I know what you're going to ask. I guess this is some kind of mind reading. Miss Wilkins visited yesterday and told me about a dream her brother had as a child when they lived here. And something must have made me think of that last night, when I was awake listening to those awful owls and those men talking and laughing in the shrubbery. By the way, I wish you'd check to see if they did any damage and tell the police about it. So, I guess it must have gone from my brain to yours while you were asleep. Curious, no doubt. And I'm sorry it gave you a bad night. You should spend as much time outside as you can today. Oh, I'm fine now. but I think I'll go over to the lodge and see if I can play golf with anyone. What about you? I have plenty to do this morning and this afternoon, if I'm not interrupted. I have my drawing. Of course! I want to see that finished very much. There was no damage in the shrubbery. Mr. Anstruther looked at the spot where the rose garden would be, where the post lay uprooted and the hole remained unfilled. He asked about Collins and learned that he was better but not well enough to work. His wife said he hoped he hadn't done anything wrong by clearing away those things. Mrs. Collins added that there were a lot of gossipy people in Westfield, and the oldest ones were the worst. They seemed to think everything of having lived in the parish longer than anyone else. But what they said, she couldn't tell, except that it upset Collins, and it was all nonsense. Refreshed by lunch and a short nap, Mrs. Anstruther sat comfortably in her sketching chair on the path through the shrubbery, leading to the churchyard gate. She loved to draw trees and buildings, and she had good views of both. She worked hard, and the drawing was becoming really nice by the time the hills to the west blocked out the sun. She would have continued, but the light was changing quickly, and it was clear she'd have to finish the last touches tomorrow. She stood up and turned towards the house, pausing for a moment to admire the clear green sky in the west. Then she walked between the dark box bushes, and, just before the path opened onto the lawn, she stopped again to look at the quiet evening landscape. She made a mental note that she could see the tower of one of the Ruthing churches on the horizon. Then a bird, or maybe something else, rustled in the bush on her left, and she turned and jumped when she saw what at first looked like a Guy Fawkes mask peeking out from the branches. She looked closer. It wasn't a mask. It was a face, large, smooth, and pink. She remembers the tiny beads of sweat on its forehead. She remembers how the jaw was clean-shaven and the eyes closed. She also remembers, with a clarity that makes the thought unbearable, how the mouth was open and a single tooth was visible below the upper lip. As she looked, the face disappeared into the darkness of the bush. She reached the shelter of the house and closed the door before she collapsed. Mr. and Mrs. Anstruther had been in Brighton for a week or so, recovering from their trip, when they received a letter from the Essex Archaeological Society. They were asked if they owned certain historical portraits that they wanted to include in a new book about Essex portraits, to be published by the Society. The letter from the secretary included the following passage. "We're especially eager to know if you have the original of the engraving, whose photograph I've enclosed. It's a portrait of Sir, Lord Chief Justice under Charles II, who, as you probably know, retired to Westfield after his disgrace, and is thought to have died there of remorse. You might be interested to know that a strange entry was recently found in the church records, not of Westfield, but of Priors Ruthing, stating that the parish was so troubled after his death that the Westfield rector called on the priests of all the Ruthings to come and lay him to rest. They did. The entry ends by saying, 'The stake is in a field next to Westfield churchyard, on the west side.' Maybe you know of any local stories about this?" The enclosed photograph reminded Mrs. Anstruther of something, and she was terribly shocked. They decided that she should spend the winter abroad. When Mr. Anstruther went back to Westfield to make the necessary arrangements, he naturally told the rector, an old man, the story. The rector wasn't surprised. "Actually, I had figured out most of what must have happened, partly from what older people have said, and partly from what I see in your grounds. Of course, we've had some troubles too. Yes, it was bad at first, like owls, as you say, and sometimes men talking. One night it was in this garden, and other times around some of the cottages. But lately, there's been very little. I think it'll die down. There's nothing in our records except the entry of the burial, and what I thought for a long time was the family motto. But last time I looked at it, I noticed that it was added later by a different hand and had the initials of one of our rectors from the late 17th century, A.C., Augustine Crompton. Here it is, you see, Quieta non movere. I guess, well, it's hard to say exactly what I think. The end. If you like the story, hit that like button and subscribe for more videos. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Was there anything that surprised you? Who's your favorite character in the story? I can't wait to hear your thoughts.